Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. This is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things in what used to be known as the global war on terror, but we now call the Long War. Today is Monday, so my co-host is Joe Truzman. Joe is my friend and colleague at FDD. He's a senior research analyst at FDD's Long War Journal, as well as editor at FDD's Long War Journal. And Joe focuses primarily on Palestinian terror groups, Hezbollah, and he knows far more than that. But those are two key areas that Joe follows and we talk about on Mondays. Joe, happy Monday.
Happy Monday to you, Bill, and I appreciate the kudos. So thank you very much. You're always very kind when you describe me, so thank you.
It's well-deserved, Joe. Anyone who knows me knows that I am not one to blow smoke, and you wouldn't be a regular on this podcast if I didn't greatly respect your opinion and your analysis. So just keep up the good work, Joe.
Thank you.
So now let's get into it. A lot going on this week. Let's start off with the Biden administration and its position on Israel. I've said and tweeted that you can't be blamed if you came to the conclusion that the administration was hostile to the Israeli government. And in a podcast last week with Benham, I had said, look, I'm not sitting here saying that the Biden administration has become an enemy of Israel. What I'm saying is, if you're following all of this, if you're watching how they fail to veto a resolution at the UN Security Council, if you're watching how they've handled the protests, how every time anti-Semitism is mentioned, the administration has to mention Islamophobia, most recently cutting off the weapons. We could go on and on. All of these things look like outward hostility towards the Israeli government. The most recent comments by Secretary of State Anthony Blinken just merely adds to that. I'll quote, as he said this on one of the weekend shows. I'm going to read from I believe this was from the Jerusalem Post, and here it goes. It says, Israel's conduct of the war, Blinken said, has put the country, quote, so this is Blinken's words, on the trajectory potentially to inherit an insurgency with many armed Hamas left, or if it leaves, a vacuum filled by chaos, filled by anarchy, and probably refilled by Hamas. We've been talking to them about a much better way of getting an enduring result, enduring security, end quote. So, Joe, a lot to unpack there. I think I will start with this, that the Biden administration, constantly puts it out there that it knows what's best for the Israelis, that it acts as if it knows how to win this war, how to prevent Hamas from coming back from power. How do you read these latest statements from Secretary Blinken?
Right. It's confusing. What I would like to know is, what is the Biden administration's position here? At the beginning of the war, super supportive of defeating Hamas, supportive of the Israeli government. It was great for the first, couple months. Then it started going downhill. So, but there's no. I don't know what their position is, right? What the Biden administration's position is. Do they want Hamas defeated? Yes or no? Everything that they've been doing and saying is quite the opposite. And worse, and moreover, Hamas sees this and understands this, and it strengthens their position at the ceasefire negotiations, right? They're put in a position of strength, right? While the Israeli military is trying to put pressure on Hamas by invading Rafah, for example, or eastern parts of Rafah. So it's just so strange. The United States, on one hand, is helping Hamas, right? On the other hand, are they helping Israel still? I think so, but it just doesn't make sense, right? And I'm just pretty much dumbfounded right now. And of course, I think you said this. I'm not sure if it was on the podcast or in private, Bill, but politics often triumphs, foreign policy or something like that. I think you know what I'm saying. So I think that's what's happening here. at least domestic politics is trumping the foreign policy right now. So I during this time, I can't believe 7 months now. We've done a lot of talking about the groups and the groups involved here, all the actors involved in Gaza and Lebanon and others and other Middle Eastern countries. But it's I think some of the blame here is on Israel, right? Some of the blame, what's happening, everything seems to be just struggling. It's just not struggling. That's not the word. It's just things seem stalled, right? And I think some of the blame here is on Israel, the strategy, right? And we can go into that, Bill. But I think there's a lot of blame to go around. But at the end of the day, the United States isn't helping right now, right? I mean, yes, they're sending. I think they continue to send weapons, right?
Yeah, there's partial blocks on. By the
Right.
way, one of the irony, Joe, and remember we had talked last Monday, and we were like, well, we got to see what it is. One of the things the administration is blocking is precision guided weapons, and the administration criticized the Israeli government for using some non-precision weapons. This was several months ago, and I remember, by the way, in an military operation, not every weapon. If the Israelis were using more than half of the weapons they were using were precision guided. That is pretty darn good. But anyway, I just find it ironic. But again, this is part of what makes you think that there's hostility here, Joe. That given that they're blocking precision guided munitions, which would reduce civilian casualties. But I look at this and again, I think it's as you said, Joe. Right? Politics is definitely playing. Domestic politics is playing a major role in this. And I think the administration, there's two things, right? The domestic politics is driving the administration's policy, and then the fear of a wider war. I think these are the two main things. I don't think the administration is full on hostile to the Israelis. I do think that there's a deep dislike, if not hatred, of Benjamin Netanyahu, but I would challenge them, if you don't like Netanyahu, just wait till you see what comes next, particularly after the way this administration has acted towards Israel. It could cause a rightward shift in Israeli politics. But anyway, I'm going on and on. Joe, one of the things that really bothered me in this statement, and you're right, the Israelis, what is their policy? And I think it's been reactionary. I think they've made a lot of mistakes, which we've talked about. Failure to go into Rafah first, failure to hold some of these cities they've cleared. That's a big mistake. The administration, so it's critical of Israel, but it's ironic what the administration wants from the Israeli government is for the Israelis to not go in on the ground and just conduct counterterrorism operations. But the argument that Blinken makes, right, inheriting, a vacuum and, all of this stuff, well, that's the argument for an occupation. And right. That isn't what the Israeli, or I don't think there's much stomach for that within this existing Israeli government. But particularly the Biden administration is not going to want to see Israel occupy. The Biden administration thinks that counterterrorism is the answer to everything. How does that deal with the tunnels? How does that deal with thousands upon thousands of Hamas fighters?
It doesn't.
Yeah, it is. And here's a question for you, Joe. It said inherent an insurgency is what Blinken says. Well, what the hell was Hamas prior to October 7th? A terror organization running a state, a terrorist government. So, what does the administration think Hamas is here?
Yeah, I don't think they have still a grip on exactly what Hamas is. I mean,
good way to put it.
No. I mean, and I could say this just by personal experience. Okay, the days leading after following October 7th, there were agencies within the U.S. government that were scrambling to understand Hamas, understand armed groups in the Gaza Strip, and they didn't know what was going on there. Essentially, all right. And we're 7 months in, and I'm sure, okay, the intelligence agency, the U.S. government has a better understanding of what's been happening in Gaza, and especially with Hamas. But that's only 7 months, right? So I still they don't get it. They don't get it. And we can say this is not only an issue with Palestinian armed groups, but in the Middle East, just when it comes to the Middle East and in the United States hasn't had a coherent foreign policy for a while. I think we can sit here and talk about Iran, for example, all day long. But anyway, yeah, they don't understand it, and what they're doing is just so counterproductive now. It just doesn't make sense. And but I think you hit it. They're just afraid. The Biden administration is scared of a regional war here, right? And that's what the beginning of the following October 7th, the days right after that, we saw the Biden administration send forces to the Mediterranean to keep Hezbollah in check, or Iran in check, and it helped, I think. But yeah, I think the Biden administration is just scared and doesn't understand, or I don't know, just scared, just really concerned about a broader war here, a regional war, and they still don't have a grip on armed groups in the Middle East, especially in Gaza. They don't understand how it works. They just don't. They're really screwing things up, unfortunately. That's just pretty blunt.
No, look, we tend to be blunt here at Generation Jihad. Let's not hold back. The administration should know exactly what Hamas is. It's almost 3 decades now. It's been designated as a foreign terrorist organization. Ironically, I looked it up, Joe. The date designated October 8th, 1997.
Yes,
almost to the day of its attack.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
On Israel, a terrorist assault on Israel. And the administration, I mean, all you needed to do is look at the footage from October 7th of last year, and you'd know what Hamas is. And yet Israel is the country that is, being treated as being the irresponsible actor here. You would, if you didn't know any better, if you just woke up on October 8th, or January 8th of 2024, you would think that Hamas is just some freedom fighting group. By the way, the administration acts here, and by the way, it's put out in the press, is Hamas is just some freedom fighting group dealing with the oppression of a state sponsor of terrorism known as Israel. That's what you would be led to believe if you listened to the administration's statements and its actions and followed its actions. It's absolutely mind numbing. It's a terrorist organization that launched an attack on Israel, and yet this administration is putting all of the blame, all of the responsibility on Israel. I go back to Joe, and I know I've said it numerous times, if Mexican drug cartels launched attacks across the border and killed 20,000 Americans, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We wouldn't be any country that said, United States, you're being too severe in your response. You need to restrain yourself. You need to negotiate. We would tell them to fuck off. Let's just be honest about it. And yet Israel somehow has to be talked down to and treated as if it's doing the wrong thing here. And it's absolutely absurd. I just, and Blinken's statements, it keeps spinning in my head here. Inherit and insurgency. What the hell has Israel inherited in Gaza since it withdrew from the territory in 2005, right? A state sponsor of terror, Hamas, funded by the United Nations, by the United States, by Europe, billions of dollars a year. And all it has done is just attack Israel at every opportunity that it can, firing rockets, terrorist attack, everything. October 7th. So the Israelis need to be worried about creating more terrorists, or in Biden's words, insurgents in Hamas. Maybe the territory is already fertile breeding ground, and nothing that Israel does is going to change that. I mean, we think the Israelis are going to win hearts and minds here, and I didn't get a chance to read the article. I saw David Petraeus, former CENTCOM commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, of course, the architect of the counterinsurgency, which the Obama administration blew up in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He's coming out and saying, the Israeli plan won't work. Well, what's your plan, David? If it is fighting a counterinsurgency, well, then that would require occupation. And so, I just don't think anyone really understands the challenges that the Israelis face. And I don't think the Israelis have taken the time to develop a coherent strategy themselves based on what I'm reading.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I don't know what the strategy is, to be quite honest with you. And there's been some reports of Netanyahu, requesting or maybe thinking about getting Arab countries involved in some sort of administrative role in Gaza. But that got quickly rebuked over the weekend. I forget who. I think it was the UAE. I can't remember. Nevertheless, it was some people didn't. Some countries didn't like that. Let's just say so. But yeah, so I don't think there's a coherent plan. At least I haven't read one, right? So I haven't seen any yet. So, but yeah, it's still Gaza's a big problem, right? But behind it, what needs to be focused on more than anything right now is the task at hand, is eliminating at least Hamas's ability to govern the Gaza Strip, to launch attacks, and its partners as well, right? That's the most important thing first and foremost. And the United States, unfortunately, now is working in the opposite direction, and it's not helpful. That's for sure.
Yeah, even if the Israelis didn't have a political solution, and by that I mean what happens the day after Hamas is defeated, they could have been working towards that goal of defeating Hamas. And I haven't seen that, right? To me, the proper plan would have been to, I've said this a million times, seal that border with Egypt because the other borders are able to be controlled by the Israelis, and put the hammer and anvil down. And if you want to include there ways to filter out civilians, et cetera, fine. I don't have a problem with that. This is a war with an organization, or dare I say, the state of Hamas that attacked Israel. And Israel has a right to respond. And, obviously within the parameters of the laws of war, which from what I see, they are following. And then, try and develop that time. But with the Israelis, they're mixing it, right? They're trying to come up with a political solution and appease the United States and its concerns. Understandably so, since the U.S. is the largest supplier of weapons and its defender in the UN. But at some point, Israel has to decide what's more important, and it has to come up with nothing will work going forward unless Hamas is defeated militarily. And Israel has squandered now 7 months in achieving that. And, I'm seeing problems, right, with okay, so it looks like they're starting an operation, or it's at the beginnings of an operation in Rafah. That's the city on the border with Israel. But the Israelis abandoned Khan Yunis, which is another large city a couple miles north of Rafah. Well, how do you think that it's possible that Hamas doesn't need to fight a battle in Rafah, that it can bleed into other areas, go into Khan Yunis or other areas? Again, so I just don't see strategy here. I don't see, and even good tactics. I'm just not seeing that from the Israelis. They're claiming they've, destroyed, X in something like 14 out of Hamas's 20 battalions, or whatever the number is, but it's something like that. But that's, but then we're seeing Hamas bleed back into areas in the north and launch mortar attack and rocket attacks against Israel. So this is very problematic. The Israelis seem to be paralyzed by, after 7 months of war.
Yeah, I think just to end this topic, I think the United States has set up an obstacle that Israel cannot meet, as far as trying to get out all the civilians and still remove Hamas from the equation. Because what Hamas is doing is it's hiding within the civilian population, right? So if civilians are able to move one way, Hamas fighters and other members of the terrorist organizations there, they'll go with the civilians, right? Because they use the civilians. So don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that Israel's should kill the civilians, but I think these obstacles that the U.S. keeps putting up, it's I don't think Israel can meet them, unfortunately. Like a credible evacuation plan for Rafah. Well, what is a credible evacuation plan for Rafah for the Americans, right? Is that even a sound strategy to defeat Hamas? I don't know, but I'm just saying that in the end, Hamas is exploiting these civilian evacuation notices, right? Israel is essentially telling Hamas where they're going, right? Where Israel's going to attack next. So yeah, it's difficult. I'm not sure I think there's strategy needs to change. If not, I just don't see Israel winning this one out.
Yeah, and if Hamas survives, there is no way the Israelis can. No matter how many Hamas fighters they kill, if Hamas it survives and is able to govern in Gaza, the Israelis lost this round, and it will be devastating for the Israelis. It only will invite further attacks on the Israeli soil.
Yeah,
and Joe, you said it right. There, not only is it the U.S. putting up obstacles that Israel could never achieve. No country could achieve this. Look, I spent a lot of time particularly in Iraq, embedding and following those wars. And the U.S. didn't make sure that Fallujah was fully cleared, or Ramadi was fully cleared, or that Mosul was fully cleared, or Tel Afar was. They made efforts to evacuate civilians. But at the end of the day, when the time came to go in and clear Al Qaeda in Iraq from those cities, the U.S. fought there. The U.S. fought a counterinsurgency in Baghdad without clearing the city. I know because I walked on patrols with units that did this. And, the Biden administration, again, is putting demands on Israel that even we wouldn't satisfy. Even the U.S. military itself wouldn't and couldn't satisfy. At the end of the day, you do your best to limit civilian casualties, but fear of taking civilian casualties cannot stop a country from achieving its objective. And in this case, it's the destruction of Hamas.
Right. Well said.
And okay, Joe, so we touched on civilian casualties there. Yeah. So the next item really, I think, transitions pretty well here. So the UN is cutting its report, or it's cutting back, it's cutting in half the number of civilian casualties that have been recorded in Gaza. I'll read from Jerusalem Post article here. Quote, on May 6th, the UN published data showing that 34,735 people had reportedly been killed in Gaza, including over 9,500 women and over 14,500 children. 2 days later, on May 8th, the UN published data showing 34,844 people had reportedly been killed, including 4,959 women and 7,797 children. So if you look at that, the number of people killed in Gaza hasn't changed, but the number of women killed was almost cut in half. The number of children killed nearly cut in half. Is this shocking, Joe?
No, definitely not. So yeah, this is important. So first off, I want to definitely give kudos to our wonderful colleague David Adesnik, who's been tracking this information. He's we have some good data. He's written some good data, good pieces rather on the about this. And I definitely recommend listeners to look him up. And I think he's got a piece in the Wall Street Journal, and there's other pieces on FDD's website. But nevertheless, yeah. So these numbers are being cut in half, almost cut in half. And listen, it shouldn't be surprising. It's still dumbfounded. I don't understand how a news organization or a government or an NGO or whoever can take data numbers from a health ministry run by Hamas and believe that their figures are accurate, right? Of course, Hamas wants to exaggerate things because they exaggerate numbers because it fits into their strategy, right? They want the international media to know, or the world, that there is an exaggerated amount, or rather, there's this. It is an exaggerated amount, but they're trying to make it seem that Israel is killing all these children and all these women, and because they are a so-called apartheid state, they are committing so-called genocide, which is all nonsense. This is unfortunately,
if this is genocide, this is the worst genocide ever.
Exactly, right.
It's ridiculous. Look, and I made the same arguments with Russia and Ukraine. I'm no fan, but if you wanted to conduct genocide, then these countries are doing it. And sometimes you're just fighting a war. Right. Again, doesn't make Russia's war in Ukraine legitimate or that I support it, but what I'm watching is a country trying to take territory, not trying to kill people. And in the case of Israel here, what I'm watching is a country trying to defeat a terrorist organization that controls a state, and not an organized genocide of a people. This term genocide, and I've warned for this for years. Everyone throws it around willy nilly, and when you start doing that, it just becomes easier and easier for people to scream genocide every time a war breaks out.
Right, because if you say it a million times, people start believing it, right? And this is exactly what's been happening over the last 7 months with these campus protests and stuff. Genocide. It's not genocide. It's not. But anyways, and people are keeping it.
Yeah, it's surprising how the average person who doesn't, when this is really one of the more troubling things in this war. Talk to a lot of people, talk to, my neighbors, my friends'
Right.
kids, whatever, right? And you hear that word used, and I say, I have to stop there. I say, look, I can show you what genocide looks like. It doesn't look like this. And, what happened in Rwanda,
Right.
Obviously the Holocaust and
Right.
what what the Chinese did during we can Pol Pot and
Right.
the Khmer Rouge, right? We can go down the list. Like, this is what genocide looks like.
Yeah.
And once you make those examples, and then I explain, this is a war with a, complicated. People tend to get it, but they're not getting that message. The Hamas, the pro-Palestinian view has seeped into the public consciousness, and people that I'm known for a very long time and know what I do for a living. And when I talk to them, I'm taken aback. And by the way, and one of the last things I want to do when I'm not working, when I'm not writing or recording the podcast, is talk about this stuff, because it's just oppressing,
Yeah.
And that I have to take time to just explain this. Like, I don't even try to say you should support Israel or you should support the Palestinians. I just try to get basic facts right. Like,
right.
You can decide on who you want to support in this one. I'm not going to sit here and try and convince you of that, because that's impossible to do in a short conversation. Can we at least not call this genocide?
Like, I know. Yeah. I agree.
But sorry, Joe, I didn't mean to.
No. It's good because it's true. That's yeah. I mean, nobody wants to be that guy that has to defend or try to defend an accusation of genocide, right? Because nobody wants to be in that position. I mean, come on. You may, even if you're right, you may end up looking like the idiot, right? Or I'm sorry, but just a jerk. But
yeah, you come off as insensitive. I don't want to have these conversations.
Exactly. It's hard, but nevertheless, not genocide. But going back to this report, yes, they have these figures, and we have to remember some super important here that's being people forget. So I've observed over like 20 since 2014, so about 10 years now. I've closely observed each conflict between Hamas and Israel. Right, there's limited conflicts, right? A few days, some that last 10 days, 50 something days, and then this one, right? And through those conflicts, Hamas has always published the deaths of fighters during the conflict. All right, sometimes there's been, I think, maybe one limited one that happened right after that they published everything. And other groups, by the way, too, have done this. They publish figures. So and so died. Whatever. He was I don't know, artillery commander, whatever, in the Northern Brigade. Anyway, but this time they are deliberately not publishing data on the deaths of fighters, and only in a handful of occasions they've done it. Only with very senior members they've published, right? And they published the deaths of fighters outside of Gaza, the Gaza Strip, the ones that are killed in southern Lebanon, for example. Anyways, they're doing this because it's in the thousands for sure. All right, and what that does is that will bring that number of the number of civilian casualties that people keep saying. With, I think it's about the ministry of the Hamas run Ministry of Health is saying, I think it's somewhere around 35 now, 36,000. If Hamas says, hey, we lost 15,000 fighters, that would do some damage to that narrative that's saying, that 36,000 people have been killed so far. Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. So they're not doing, they're deliberately keeping these numbers hidden, right? We may never know the exact number, to be quite honest with you. But this is something I've observed over the last 7 months, and I can see it from a mile away. Something's definitely fishy here, right? But most people now, that they're reading this stuff on TikTok and whatever, or they don't understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So they just see these numbers and, oh yeah, they're right. And worst off, we're getting these numbers are being they're being put on, the New York. I wouldn't say the New York Times because I don't remember exactly, but journalists are citing these numbers. Even the president of the United States cited the numbers, right? This is crazy, crazy. I could never imagine the president of the United States citing numbers from the Hamas, the health ministry run by Hamas. You know the funny thing about this, the spokesperson of the Ministry of Health that's run by Hamas, his name is Ashraf Al Qudra. He fled in the middle of the war. He left through the Rafah crossing into Egypt. All right, he took off, and it's just this is all fishy stuff. It's just. But anyway, I get almost angry talking about this, but this is a situation. It's nuts. It's nuts, Bill.
Yeah, Joe, that's another thing, right? With having conversations with people, like it's hard to not just be dismissive. Like we know it's the curse of knowing too much. Where you're like, that's just so wrong. Then you wind up insulting people, right? Because they think they know something. Another thing on those numbers, right? 7,797 children. What's a child to the Palestinian health ministry? Yeah. Does this include children, and I put that in quotes, who are serving as soldiers and doing things like spotting and communications, running ammunition, or even shooting? Is a 19-year-old male who's been killed while fighting alongside Hamas, is that a child? How does Hamas define a child in this context? Like, I'd love to look and see what that number, how many of them are what we would call military age males, or even 12-year-olds who are doing work for Hamas.
From the work I've done over the years, I come into child soldiers. When it comes to Hamas specifically,
it's disgusting, isn't it, Joe?
I do come. I mean, they set up. They used to have. Obviously now they don't, but because of the war. But they'd hold yearly summer camps. Sometimes even in the winter. Other groups do this, by the way. All these camps, right? And they train kids. They train children to shoot, and it's part of instilling, the so-called resistance in these children's minds. Because essentially, what it is, these camps, and they're very similar to Hezbollah's Mahdi scouts, where they're like a stepping stone to joining the group, to joining Hamas, right? So if you keep going every year, you learn. You get to know other kids that are doing the same thing, and you train with these advisors, right? These Hamas advisors. It's really messed up, but we see this a lot with a lot of the Axis of Resistance members of the Axis of Resistance. The Houthis do this type of stuff. Again, like I said, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad. So they train kids. It's messed up, but they do, and these kids do act as they play a role. They play a role in fighting. And I can think of a couple of examples just off the top of my head where a child has been killed because he was taking part in shooting and fighting and active combat. Okay. So with Israel, it's crazy. It's crazy to think that, but that's the thing with the Western mentality, I think. They can't understand. People here, especially in the United States, I feel like they don't get it in their minds that these groups use children to in war, right? And I see it a lot in the West Bank too. It's really awful, but people just don't get that children are being used here for
and it's common to these Islamist groups. Like, we track this with Islamic State, with groups like Turkestan Islamic Party, which really love to put the little young lions, they call them, in their videos and show them shooting firearms. Yeah. They're indoctrinating these kids at the young age. They're grooming them. They're grooming them to be the next generation of Hamas. And this is the danger that the Israelis created for themselves. This is the dilemma they created for themselves with withdrawing from Gaza and allowing Hamas to take power. And we've now had, we're approaching 2 decades of indoctrination, of these summer camps, of television programs. Like, with fake Mickey Mouse.
The Far Four?
Yeah, right.
Far
I mean,
Four.
not even a good Mickey Mouse costume. It's like not even like it wouldn't even be good at a mall here in the United
Oh,
States.
it's so bad.
It's
But you
so
have to look
bad.
it up. People have to look it up. Far For the Mouse. You'll see what Bill's talking about. It's
And we laugh
it's
about it, but
interesting.
it's just sick. This is
It
what I
is.
remember. There was like a fake Elmo way back when, and calling for jihad, and it's this is what the Israelis contend with, and people don't see this. All they see is dead children, dead children, dead children.
Right.
Which
And
numbers are being played? And don't get me wrong, it's horrific and it's sad, but war is ugly. And if Hamas doesn't want dead children, it could surrender today and surrender its leaders and lay down its arms, and it could do that. Or it could have just not launched the attack on October 7th. The Israelis were more than happy. And this is how the Israelis got into this conundrum. This is how the Hamas was able to exploit an attack, because the Israelis were just fine with not having to deal with Hamas. There was no fighting for 2 years, Joe? Is that right?
Well, directly with Hamas, yeah, I would say 2021 was the last real conflict between Hamas and Israel. After that, it was mostly Islamic Jihad and other groups against Israel, but those were very limited periods of fighting. But yeah,
we weren't talking about an open conflict here. This was like, from the Israeli standpoint, and you could understand it up until this is a manageable thing we're dealing with. And let's face it, Joe, you have said this numerous times. Palestinian Islamic Jihad or other of these groups probably don't do it without some type of nod and a wink from Hamas. But we weren't talking about a level of violence that would provoke the Israelis to go in and attack and raid to destroy the tunnels and kill thousands of Hamas fighters. So
right. Things are very different now.
Yeah, and it's just stunning. All right, Joe, our final topic for discussion. You noted this on Twitter earlier today that Hamas published an unfounded claim that it's a lost contact with a group that was of its fighters that were guarding hostages. And this occurred they lost contact after an Israeli airstrike, I believe.
Yeah.
And apparently American citizen, his name is Hirsch Goldberg Poland. He was one of the hostages amongst that group. What's going on here, Joe?
Yeah.
I mean, it's still stunning that we're 7+ months and there's still American hostages, right? Hamas can't even give America its hostages back. It's held America hostage. It's crazy. But to the details of the story, that's one of my rants.
No, I'm right there with you. It's ridiculous. Since day one. I mean, I think you said it first. Biden should have said, give us our hostages back, our people back, or else. I don't get it, but
we're putting demands on Israel. Look, and this is where, again, I can, put aside, my support for Israel because the Hamas is a terrorist organization, and you could some way sort of compartmentalize that. If there's no American hostages, like that's an Israel and Hamas problem, but there's American citizens involved here, and I have a vested interest in that. And there is just absolutely no reason that we should do anything that supports Hamas while there is a single American being held hostage. But again, back to the point of this claim by Hamas. Tell us.
Right. No, I completely agree with you, Bill. So essentially, what Hamas has been doing over the last 7+ months now is that there's a lot of propaganda. Okay, they've been doing it for years, actually, with hostages. They've had Israeli citizens as held hostage in Gaza since 2014. So every now and then they'd publish videos and just propaganda. But what they're doing the same thing now. Okay. In some cases, some of the propaganda actually has some evidence, right, that supports what Hamas is conveying. Like, for example, if they say so and so was killed, and then in the video they show a body of the person. So that's video evidence that supports the narrative, right? Their claim. But it's a lot. What we're hearing from a lot of is these hostages are dying from Israeli airstrikes, but in the fact it's quite the opposite. They're being killed by Hamas, and I can't say with every single one of them, but I know in certain cases this has happened, where the bodies of hostages have been recovered and we find out that they've been killed by Hamas, at least from by forensic experts that they can tell, right? So right now, with these publications, this propaganda Hamas is publishing, they're doing it because of two things. They're doing it to pressure the Israeli government into negotiating a ceasefire that's on Hamas's terms. Now, when they publish this type of propaganda, right, they know that the Israeli public's going to see it, thus it will put pressure on Bibi Netanyahu's government right now, because there is a movement right now that that's led by people, by the families of hostages that are pressuring the government right now, the Israeli government, to sign a ceasefire, right? To agree to a ceasefire, because naturally they want their loved ones out. And I definitely don't blame them. I think the problem is we don't know how many of those hostages are still alive. And my concern has been from day one is that a lot of these hostages, I'm not going to put a number on it because I definitely don't know, but that a lot of these hostages are deceased. All right, they're now deceased, or back when at the beginning of the war, they were going to end up deceased, right? Because Hamas is a terrorist organization. That's what terrorists do. They kill people. And I'm afraid that's the issue here, that a lot of these hostages are unfortunately deceased. We don't know for sure though. So Hamas is trying to pressure the government, Israeli government. That's what they're trying to do more than anything with these propaganda videos. And the one that was published today is of an American citizen, but there's no video. This one was just a statement from the Hamas spokesperson, Abu Ubaidah. And he said that they had lost contact with fighters about 10 days ago that were guarding hostages. And then he said, including the hostage, Hirsch Goldberg, Poland, I think it's, if you can, maybe you may correct me there, but Bill, but regardless, that's the statement that was published today. So in effect, it's again,
it was Hirsch Goldberg, Poland.
Okay, yes, yeah. So in effect, what they're doing is pressuring the government. That's what they're trying to do. All right, but they didn't offer any evidence, and we've seen already with previous publications these propaganda videos of hostages published by Hamas and Islamic Jihad that they were BS. Okay, because in one of them, I think it was Islamic Jihad, they said so and so is dead. But then she came out in a hostage a negotiation, a ceasefire. She was released. She wasn't dead. So that tipped us off already that Hamas and its allies are BSing a lot of times. Okay, when it comes to this propaganda, but something a lot of observers should have known already. So that's where we're at now. We'll see what happens with a lot of these hostages. I don't know. I hear a lot in the news that they're in Rafah. I don't know, honestly. I mean, for all we know, they could be in Egypt, to be quite honest with you. Just
another one of the implications of not seeing that border is that we don't know what's gone back and forth from that border since October 7th.
Exactly. So I'm always skeptical when I hear those type of reports. But so we'll see. But at the end of the day, just when you read reports of hostage videos from Hamas, just take it with a big grain of salt. That a lot of it is just propaganda. It's just nonsense what they're talking about. And some people, and some in Israel, some news organizations won't air hostage videos. Some do for their own reasons. But that's where we're at right now, at least with what happened today with this statement from Hamas.
So one of the things about doing this job is learning how to read the statements, the propaganda from your enemies. It takes time, but once you really understand, once you can get into their head and see the whys and hows of what they're saying, and pick up on some of the nuances, you really learn a lot about these groups, and you got to trust your instincts on these as well. And that's what you're telling us right now. And it's an interesting phenomenon. This is how I knew. Once I figured out how to read the Taliban, a decade and a half ago, it became really easy to see what was happening. What was real, what wasn't real, what you could put weight on, what you couldn't put weight on. And it really helps you, again, understand these groups and be able to try to figure out what comes next.
Right. It just boils down to experience. That's it. Yeah. I mean, years and years of reading these darn statements from these groups or for whatever reasons that they were publishing, you can eventually figure out when it's real and when it's not, right? So, and that, again, that's just boils down to experience. So nevertheless, today I think it was just a lot of propaganda with a lot, just as we've seen before with previous hostage videos. So, or at least statements from about the hostages from Hamas. So we'll see what happens. I mean, they're trying to get Hamas wants a deal, I think, but they don't, and they obviously don't want the IDF to go into Rafah as well. So I think this is another reason why they published the statement. But we'll see what happens. Every day I think to myself, okay, is today the day that the IDF finds Yahya Sinwar or one of the other Hamas leaders? And I look forward to talking about that one of these days. We'll see. But
it's that tough point of the war, Joe, where it's hard to find wins, right?
Right. Yeah.
And believe me, they come few and far between. Israel has so much stacked against it, the public opinion, the perceptions, and faults of its own, the way it's prosecuting this war. And it's funny, we're criticizing from the side of, Israel do better.
Exactly.
And, I'm quite familiar with this position.
Yeah.
I was there in Iraq, I was there in Afghanistan, and Somalia, and all other places. It's a tough place to be. We can only hope that the Israeli government gets it together because, again, as you and I have said it numerous times, time is not on their side.
Yep, exactly. I'm afraid we're getting there. So thanks for having me, Bill. We'll talk again next week.
Excellent, Joe. You have a great day. And thanks, everyone, for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can listen to us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to the podcast. Please subscribe to Generation Jihad and leave us a review, preferably a positive one, but only if we earned it. Thanks again. We'll see you all again real soon.